So last week, Michael, we talked about how scholars, and serious scholars, I'm not talking about, wackadoodles on Facebook, I'm talking about serious university scholars who are trying to understand how the name was pronounced, the name of the Father was pronounced in ancient times, will go to the depths of every pagan, magical, and Gnostic source, anybody but the Jews. And it's somewhat of a mystery of why they won't look at Jewish sources. And I started doing some study about this a few months back. I'd read a book in which this one scholar had said, a serious scholar, he said this name Yehovah is a distinctly Christian form, that no Jew ever thought the name was Yehovah, and it was simply the Christians misunderstanding what they saw in the Hebrew manuscripts. And it got me to ask a question I'd never asked before. And the question it forced me to ask, it made me ask was, what do the rabbis say the name is? Because I'd only looked at the Bible, and I at that time had found the name in 5 Hebrew manuscripts, in a period, think about that, of 15 years or more.
Yeah, these are Bible manuscripts where all of the vowels appear, so exactly. It could be pronounced.
Right, it's the Aleppo Codex, the Leningrad Codex. I'd found it in 5 Hebrew manuscripts at the time, but I never even really asked the question, what do the rabbis say the name? And it is a good question. Mm-hmm. So I called my book Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence. And the idea behind that name is that we have an actual conspiracy that's described in the Babylonian Talmud, the Tractate of Kedushin 71a, and it's brought, we even have the name of the head conspirator. His name is Rabba Bar Bar Chana. It's kind of a hard name to say. Rabba Bar Bar Chana. And he lived around the year 250 to 300 AD. And he says as follows, he said, sages transmit the 4-letter name to their disciples once in a 7-year period. So what he's describing is, by the year 250, Jews were no longer commonly speaking the name. It had been forbidden by the Romans, and there was an internal reason to suppress people healing in the name. And it's really interesting. We talked last week how there were both Jews and probably also Jews who believed in Yeshua who were healing in the name of the Father, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and the rabbis wanted to suppress this, the Romans wanted to suppress this, so everybody was happy, right? But the rabbis still preserved this name, and they preserved it by transmitting it from rabbi to disciple once every 7 years. So that's a conspiracy of silence. We know, meaning we, the rabbis, know what the name is. We don't want the multitudes, and definitely not the Christians, to know, meaning that was really part of it. They were saying what they defined as Christians or Messianic Jews, Nazarenes, using this name, or as they saw maybe even abusing the name. We said, let's just ban it. And they said, well, ban it until when the Messiah comes. And they talk about how it's not permissible to speak it in this world, but in the world to come when the Messiah reigns as king, then we'll speak the name. But to preserve the name, they transmitted it rabbi to disciple once every 7 years. So
now in that was actually a ceremony.
So you're jumping ahead because I told you about this.
Yeah, we're spoiling. We're letting you.
Spoiler alert!
Yeah, we're letting you in on what we get to do for hours and hours and hours and hours.
Right.
You get a little bit of this. And so this is
right,
so
last
exciting.
night Michael got the 6-hour version. I'm going to give you the condensed version this time, guys. All right. So at the time I wrote the book Shattering the Conspiracy of Silence in 2012, I knew about this source. I didn't know about the other sources.
Okay.
And what I knew is that the rabbis in the Talmud in the year 250 AD are telling us they transmit the name every 7 years. But the reason scholars will plumb the depths of every pagan source for the pronunciation of the name is they don't believe what the Talmud says. They said, come on, the rabbis didn't really transmit the name once every 7 years. Surely if they did that, we'd find traces of it in later Jewish sources, right? Mm-hmm. And where are those traces? Meaning, we have over 100,000 Jewish books, and I mentioned to you I have a database with over 100,000 Jewish books. It came out of Bar-Ilan University. It costs about $1,000 with all the updates. And scholars at Bar-Ilan University have been typing in Jewish books since the 1970s. To the point where they've gotten to so many books, you can do a search, and you're not looking at all of Jewish literature, but you're looking at a large percentage of every Jewish book that's ever been written. It might be, and I don't know the number, but it's somewhere between 25 and 75% of all Jewish books ever written that have survived, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. There's other books in manuscript that have never been printed. There's other books that, they'll eventually get to, right? Anyway, and I got to tell you a funny story about this. So I went to get an update. You got to get an update every few years on this database. And I went to get the update, and I paid the money for the update. It was a couple $100. And they say, okay, well, we have a guy in Jerusalem that you can get it from. You don't have to come all the way to Tel Aviv, where Bar-Ilan University is located. So I go to somebody's apartment in Jerusalem, and he's an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and he looks at me and he says, why do you want this database? This is 100,000 books written by rabbis. You're not wearing a kippah. Why would you be interested in this? And I said, I paid the money. Are you not going to give it to me? And, I got all defensive. And he says, no, I'm seriously, genuinely asking. I've never seen somebody who doesn't wear a kippah, who's not an ultra-Orthodox Jew, be interested in a database of 100,000 rabbinical books. And I said, well, I'm a researcher of ancient Jewish sources. All right, no problem. I'm not trying to start a fight. I've just never seen it before. So I get this database, Michael.
Calm down, Nehemia.
Right, well, I'm Israeli. I get defensive, So I get this database, and I'm asking the question, are there any rabbis who say what the name is? And I think, I don't think there are. If there were, I would have heard about it, right? If somebody's writing a paper, a serious paper in a scholarly journal about how the Gnostic pronounced the name, and I've never read a paper, and I've read, I think, everything there is on the name, just about, in academic scholarship, surely somebody would have published this, right? It must be there, and I would know about it. So I put it's a flash drive, I put it in, it's all in Hebrew. Even the interface is in Hebrew. It doesn't say search, It says chapes, right? So I type it in, and I do a little search, and I'm like, I know I'm not going to find it. Within 30 seconds, I found a rabbi who said the name is Yehovah. Within literally 30 seconds. Within literally 30 seconds, I found a rabbi who said the name, the Shema Mefurash, the explicit name, the unequivocal name, is with the vowels Shva, Cholam, Kamat, and you're going to hear that, guys, over and over today. Shva, Cholam, Kamat, those are the names of the vowels. They have names, the vowels. Shva is that little E in Yehovah. Cholam is the O, and the Kamatz is the A. So this rabbi says unequivocally, without a question, he says, as a matter of fact, yeah, as we know, the vowels are, or he doesn't say as we know, he says the vowels of the name which are Shva, Cholam, Kamatz. He states it matter-of-factly. Within 30 seconds, I found that. And I was sitting there shaking. I didn't think I would find it. And there I found it in 30 seconds. And I realized, if I found this in 30 seconds, and all I did was search in the database. Now, I had to have the database, and I had to be able to read Hebrew and search in Hebrew. But literally, it took me 30 seconds to find it. And what it made me realize is if I could find it in 30 seconds, and nobody's ever talked about this that I've ever read in scholarship. They're talking about the Gnostics, and they're talking about the Greek magical papyri, but not this source. That means nobody's ever looked. Because if they'd looked, they would have found it. In 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Maybe it would have taken them 5 minutes. I'm good. But literally nobody's ever looked to see what do the rabbis say the name is, and why don't they look? So the reason they don't look, and I looked this up in Hebrew Jewish sources, you can't blame the pagans or the Christians or the agnostics for this. This is Jewish Israeli sources, an encyclopedia in Hebrew. And it's saying our rabbis, these are Orthodox Jews writing, saying our rabbis didn't know how to pronounce the name, and they give a source. So what do? I'm a troublemaker. I look up the source. And you know what the source says, Michael? It's a source from around 1750 from a rabbi named Elijah of Vilna. Let me read you what it says. It's pretty cool. Now, he was actually, turns out, the rabbi of my ancestor, of my fifth great-grandfather. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was the number one disciple of Elijah of Vilna. And what Elijah of Vilna, who's quoted in the encyclopedia as the source that the rabbis don't know the name, what he said was...
Okay, so this is a...
This is a rabbi in around 1750, and it's taken as well. The Jews don't know the name, Elijah of Vilna. And he was a brilliant... He's called the Vilna Gaon, which means the genius of Vilna. And if I can find you the source, I can read it to you. And give me a second here. I'm doing my little search here. 1 second. I have like dozens and dozens of sources on my laptop here. And... okay, so he says, the vowels of the name itself are hidden. Its vowels are the secret of the tetragrammaton. Okay, so we know that.
Okay.
Meaning the consonants of the tetragrammaton of the name, Yud He Vav He, of the name of the Father, that's not even a question. They're Yud He Vav He. The vowels are the secret of the tetragrammaton, and he says the vowels of the name itself are hidden. So the modern 20th century encyclopedia written in Hebrew by rabbis say, well, the rabbis didn't know what the vowels were. Is that what he says?
No.
No, he says they're hidden.
Right.
He doesn't say he doesn't know what they are.
Doesn't say don't know how to pronounce it.
He's not saying I don't know how to pronounce it. He's saying this is hidden. We don't reveal this secret, which is a big difference. Now, so I mentioned before that.
So an encyclopedia is where people are getting their information from, and the encyclopedia is incorrectly quoting the source.
Well, no, it's interpreting the source.
Interpreting the source.
And so what I do is I look up the source, and it doesn't say what they claim it says. Now, if that was all the information, you could argue back and forth. Did the rabbis know what the name was, or didn't they know what the name was, right? I mean, he's a rabbi who says it's hidden. Mm-hmm. Is it hidden to him, or is it just hidden to the public? So, and they transmitted it every 7 years. Surely there must be a trace of that somewhere in Jewish literature, that this ceremony continued of transmitting the name once every 7 years. So, while I was doing this research, I stumbled upon a reference to something called Sefer Hashem, the Book of the Divine Name. It's by a rabbi named Elazar Rokeach, who's known in English usually as Elazar of Worms. Worms is a city in Germany. Mm-hmm. And this rabbi wrote a book in the year 1225, the Book of the Divine Name. And the amazing thing about this is the book was never printed. And it wasn't printed until the year 2004. So this is a book that remained in handwritten manuscript form even after printing was invented, because it was considered so secret. And it wasn't until the 21st century that somebody decided to, break the secret. I mean, because printing's so easy today, right? Anybody with a desktop computer and literally a physical printer can print a book. And, so someone in 2004 for the first time printed a book from 1225. And so I heard about this Book of the Divine Name, and what it describes in it is the exact type of thing described in the Talmud, but 1,000 years later, a ceremony of transmitting the name.
1,000 years after.
1,000 years after Rabbi Bar Bar Chana saying, sages transmit the name to their disciples, we see how this was done by this rabbi in 1225. And what he describes is this elaborate ceremony. And in the elaborate ceremony, you have a rabbi and a disciple who go through a purification process. They fast, and they immerse themselves in a mikveh of water, and then they don white clothing, and then they do something a little bit strange at first until you read it in Hebrew. And by the way, it was printed for the first time in 2004, after nearly 800 years, and it's never been translated into English. In fact, the general public will hear this text for the first time ever in English. If I read you a little excerpt here, it's never been translated into English.
Okay, so here it is. It's going out to more than 127 countries around the world the first time, and here it is.
So it describes this ceremony. I won't read the whole thing because I want to get to some other things, but it talks about them fasting, and then it says the rabbi will, and it says one of the part of the ceremony is they stand up to their ankles in water. Seems really strange. And it talks earlier in the ceremony, they reveal the name over water. There's a strange ceremony taking place related to water. They're immersing in water, and they're standing in water, and so what does this mean? So it says as follows. It says, the rabbi will then open his mouth after all this preparation in awe and say, blessed are you, and then he speaks the name. Yehovah, our God, King of the universe, Yehovah, God of Israel, you are one and your name is one. And Michael, you are one and your name is one. That's a reference to Zechariah 14, verse 9. Michael, you asked me the other day, we were discussing this beforehand, you asked me, so when was, one of the first times you became aware of the issue of the name? And one of the things I've shared in the past is Zechariah 14:9 was a verse that was burned into my heart early on. It's actually the closing verse of daily rabbinical prayers that I grew up with. And I got to be honest, Michael, the rabbis have daily prayers that I was expected to go to. Sometimes I only came at the end. I was bored during these prayers by rote, but I always loved that prayer at the end. And it's the verse in Zechariah 14:9, and I still remember it as the song I heard in the synagogue. Can I sing it for you?
Please do.
So in Hebrew, and remember, in the synagogue, the tradition is don't speak the name Yehovah, speak it as Adonai. So that's how I remember it. Mm-hmm. But the verse was, Vahaya Adonai. This is the closing part of the entire long 45-minute prayer service, and on Shabbat, like more than 40, like a long prayer service. It'd be like 2 hours. Vahaya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz bayom hahu yihyeh Adonai echad ushemo echad. And it shall come to pass that Yehovah will be king over the entire earth. And on that day, Yehovah will be one, and his name, and his name will be one. So that just gets into every fiber of your being when you hear this day after day, week after week. And I remember being there in the prayers thinking, what they just did for 45 minutes, oh, I'm so bored. But this I connect to. The hope that one day Yehovah will be king over the entire earth, here on earth, not in some kind of mystical sense, but we'll have peace over the entire earth with Yehovah as our king, having defeated our enemies, bring peace to the world, and everyone will call on his name will be one. Everyone will call on his name. So that was early on, without even realizing I was being tied to the name, that just permeated my very soul. And that's the verse that the rabbi is referring to here when he makes the statement, blessed are you. And when he says it in the ceremony, he doesn't say, blessed are you, Adonai. He says, blessed are you, and he says the actual name, Yehovah. He says, blessed are you, Yehovah, our God, King of the universe, Yehovah, God of Israel. You are one, and your name is one. And he says, you commanded us to hide your great name. Where did he command that? That's in the oral tradition, right? And so as part of that tradition, we have to hide the name, but we're not blotting out the name, so we're transmitting it to our disciples. And I'll skip ahead here. He has a bunch of blessings, and then it says, the rabbi and his disciple shall place their eyes upon the water. And then they speak together in unison, the rabbi and his disciple, and they speak the name, and they speak the name by quoting a verse, Psalm 29:3. Now, 29:3 says, the voice, in the King James, the voice of the Lord is upon the waters. It's not a bad translation. It's the voice of Yehovah is upon the waters. But the way they understand the verse and the way they translate it, I mean, they're saying it in Hebrew, but the way they understand the verse, which is a valid way of understanding it, is the sound of Yehovah upon the water. And so at that moment, they both recite together the verse based on their interpretation, the sound of Yehovah upon the water. And at that moment, the rabbi has spoken it once by himself and a number of times by itself. The disciple heard it after this whole ceremony, and then they speak it together to make sure the disciple heard it correctly. And this is something that the rabbis were doing in 1225. So this idea that, well, yeah, the Jews might have known the name in ancient times, but because of the ban, they forgot it. That's not consistent with the Jewish sources. And remember, this is a source that most scholars don't know about. I found this buried in a series by a professor named Joseph Dan. He's one of the top scholars in the world in Judaic studies. He won the Israel Prize, which is the Jewish world's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, but for Jewish studies. I did an interview with him, and he wrote a 6,000-page series. It's like 12 volumes or something so far, and it's going to be more in the end. But so far, he's written 6,000 pages. On volume 6, page 561, he explains that this isn't just some theoretical thing. He says this is something Rabbi Elazar did. This is an actual ceremony that this rabbi participated in, donned white clothes and dressed, having immersed in water, and then he revealed the pronunciation of the name to his disciple. So what that tells you is we don't need to go to the Gnostic sources or pagan sources or Christian sources who didn't know Hebrew or Latin sources. We have rabbis who knew the name. Now, I could stop here, but there's another source that confirms this. And this is a source that was written in Hebrew around the year 1450 by a little-known rabbi in Jerusalem named Joseph ibn Sayach. And he wrote a book that's never been printed, even today. So if you wanted to read this in Hebrew, there's only one place you can find it. And I actually have here the manuscript, a photo of the manuscript. And I've actually highlighted the section I'm going to translate now. But here's the section from the manuscript. And this is interesting, this manuscript. This is the copy written by Joseph ibn Sayach. Not only was it never printed, but it was never even copied. This is the original. This is the original by the author. There's only one copy that ever existed, and we have his copy. And in this book, he answers a series of questions that people sent him as letters. And they would include a little bit of money, right? They'd send an email, basically, but it was, a scroll, and they'd send some money with, and they'd say, look, Rabbi, we have a question. We need you to give us a binding answer. We have a problem in our community, and this is question number 43. I don't even know what question 1 through 42 are, but, there's about 100 questions or something in this book. It's very common. There's thousands of Jewish books like this. Many of them have never been printed. So, at least as of today, this has never been printed. So question number 43 that they sent to Ibn Sayach in the 15th century in Jerusalem, and they say as follows: a certain sage has been uttering the name according to its letters, and a certain rabbi rebuked him for this. But the sage was stubborn in his actions. So what they're describing here is they're saying, Rabbi, help us. There's a sage in our community who's speaking the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And our local rabbi, the leader, rebuked him, and he says, I don't care what you say, I'm a sage. You might be a rabbi, but I'm whatever a sage meant. It's an interesting question. It may have meant he was some kind of mystic, maybe, I don't know. So he's being rebuked for speaking the name, this rabbi whose name we don't know, and that shows you somebody knew how to speak the name in the 15th century. But I thought the Jews don't know the name, right? That's the one thing all scholars can agree on. We should go look at the Gnostic. We should go look at the Greeks. We should go look at the Christians. Anybody but the Jews, because the Jews don't know the name. But here we have one source of a rabbi transmitting the name to his disciple. And in the second case, not only does the rabbi receive the name from his rabbi, but he's speaking it out loud and getting in trouble for it. And the interesting thing is Ibn Sayyah rebukes the sage for speaking the name. He says, you're sinning. You're not allowed to speak this name. It's forbidden by our tradition, not by the Torah, but by our tradition. So what we've established here is that the rabbis did know how to pronounce the name.